Welcome back. Now that we have covered the periods of history for the city of Rome relevant to the course on Roman comedy, let's now talk a little bit more specifically about Roman comedy itself. It turns out that much of what you need to know about Roman comedy has already been covered indirectly in our discussion of Greek Middle and New comedy, so there's not too much, fortunately, to add. But we will now add in the specifics about Roman comedy to help you put that genre in context. So the critical date that I alluded to in the video in which I mentioned Carthage is this date, 240 BC. Now, you may recall in our history video about the Roman Republic that Rome was entangled in a series of wars with three locations: Carthage in North Africa, and Macedonia north of Greece, and then Greece itself. And that period in which Rome was occupied with those wars was 264 BC, which is the beginning of the First Punic War, down to 146 BC, in which both Carthage and Corinth, remarkably simultaneously in the same year, were destroyed and ceased to pose further threats to Roman imperial growth, as will be defined in a century thereafter. So you notice that this date, 240 BC, comes near the latter end of the First Punic War, which, as a matter of fact, is considered to have gone from 264 down to 241 BC. So the settlement was about that time. Notice that with Roman expansion outside of Carthage, that's when the Romans start getting much more interactive with the outside world, as we talked about in a previous video, and that's when the Romans begin to realize that they can actually adopt many of those outside forms, especially the Greek ones, into their own literature and especially their own form of drama. So 240 BC is the pivotal year in which this author, Livius Andronicus, put on the first Roman play. Now, Livius Andronicus is also our first surviving Roman author, and unfortunately, we do not have his works surviving. They're almost entirely in fragments. However, we do know that Andronicus wrote several different types of works. Besides plays, he also put the first Latin translation of a Greek epic work down. He did not use the same hexameter work. There would be later authors who would work on those, but instead he used a meter that was taken from the local literature of the time, called the Saturnian meter, a very complicated one to use. And using the Saturnian meter, he translated Homer's Odyssey into Latin. Not too long after Livius, we get another Saturnian meter epic, this time written by an author named Gnaeus Naevius, who wrote a work about the Punic Wars, and it was called Bella Punica, also in the same Saturnian meter. So we know that already by this period, there's quite a bit of an interest in writing extended poetry, very similar to what Homer wrote. However, they hadn't mastered the actual meter yet that was really needed in order to write a true epic, as you see much more famously later with Virgil's Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphoses, discussed by me in a different URI course. So, okay, so 240 BC is when things get started. So Livius Andronicus wrote an epic poem, but he also wrote quite a few plays, both comedies and tragedies. It appears that he is practically the only early writer prior to Plautus who devotes significant time to writing comedies. Although we have several other early authors whose works we have in fragments who wrote tragedies, it doesn't appear that anybody else devoted much serious time to comedy other than Livius Andronicus. So that means, interestingly, that we have a skip down from Andronicus all the way down to Plautus and Terence. But luckily, Plautus is not too long after the period of Andronicus, next generation down. And so, of course, he was writing his plays at the end of the 3rd century BC and the beginning of the 2nd century BC. So there actually wasn't as long a gap between the origins of comedy and the fully developed comedy of Plautus as one might have thought. And also, of course, Terence is in there too, from 190 down to 160 BC. So again, the time period is in fact not really that long. So Roman comedy ends up starting at a very specific, very clean, neat time, right there at 240 BC, and gets going right away. Again, by this time, the Romans would have had exposure to Eastern influence, specifically to Greek forms of literature, including, for our purposes, Greek New Comedy, as you've already seen, of course, with Menander. The Romans would have picked them up and started learning how to adapt them relatively quickly. And once they started learning how to adapt pieces of literature like that, especially the genres, then they moved along pretty rapidly. And as we talk about in another course, it really took only 2 or 3 centuries, which is really a relatively brief time, for the Romans to go from just starting out to expert in the field. Okay, so there's a general overview of Roman comedy. In our next video, we're going to talk specifically about the format of Roman comedy that the Romans came up with. We'll see you next video.